I used to think a mother's love was measured by how quickly she said yes. For 15 years I said yes to everything. College tuition, wedding bills, late-night emergencies, even when it meant skipping meals or ignoring my own needs. Then, one afternoon, my daughter called me, her voice shaking with urgency. "Mom, the roof is about to collapse. We need $15,000 today." But when I asked for an estimate, just a simple explanation, something shifted. Her husband snapped, and my daughter, my own flesh and blood, uttered 9 words that knocked the air out of me. That was the moment I finally opened my eyes. And everything began to change. If you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. After David passed, the world grew quieter in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow. Our house, once full of shared laughter and sleepy Sunday breakfasts, was reduced to the clicking of my heels across cold kitchen tiles and the occasional creak of the furnace kicking on. Lillian had just turned 18. She was preparing to leave for college, eyes wide with dreams and freedom. And I was suddenly a widow trying to figure out how to keep everything together without the man who had always shared the weight with me. There was no time to grieve properly. The tuition bill for Northwestern arrived before the condolence cards stopped coming. $68,000 a year. I remember staring at the envelope, my coffee going cold in my hand, wondering how we were going to do this. David and I had set aside something for college, but not nearly enough. He always believed Lillian would get scholarships, and she did get some. Just not the kind that cover room board books and everything else that comes with moving halfway across the country. I took out a second mortgage. I extended my work hours. The factory was willing to give me overtime because I was meticulous and never called out. Some nights I would come home, drop my bag by the door, and sit on the couch without turning the lights on, too tired to even take off my shoes. But I did it, and I did it with pride, because Lillian was going to have everything she deserved. Everything I had once dreamed of for myself but put aside. The first semester came and went, then the first year. She called occasionally, usually about money. "Textbooks are outrageous this year," she'd say. Or "the girls are going to Cancun for spring break. I know it's a lot, but it's a once-in-a-lifetime trip." Once, when I hesitated, she sighed and said, "Never mind. I'll just stay here alone while everyone else has fun." I sent the money that same night. I always did. By her senior year, I had become so used to giving that I didn't notice how one-sided our conversations had become. We rarely spoke about anything beyond what she needed. She didn't ask how I was doing or if I was managing all right. On her graduation day, I drove 8 hours, stayed in a budget motel 45 minutes away because the closer ones were too expensive, and sat in the bleachers in a cheap dress I'd worn to 3 funerals. She hugged me briefly after the ceremony, took a few photos, and ran off to a party with her friends. "That's my dad," she told one of her sorority sisters, laughing. "The one who pays for everything." She meant it as a joke, but it stung. That was the first time I felt invisible. Things moved quickly after that. She moved in with Grayson shortly after graduation. He was charming, well-dressed, and spoke with that smooth confidence that made you feel like he knew what he was doing. He shook my hand with both of his and called me ma'am. He offered to pay for dinner when we met, even though I noticed Lillian subtly sliding her card to the waiter while he wasn't looking. They announced their engagement at a backyard barbecue. I remember the way Grayson toasted me in front of everyone, thanking me for raising such an incredible woman, and how Lillian wrapped her arm around his and looked up at him like he hung the stars. They made an attractive couple. Picture perfect, at least from the outside. When wedding planning began, it was clear who would be footing the bill. Mom Lillian said one evening over the phone, "You know this is once in a lifetime, right?" I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "I mean, we want it to be special, not tacky. I found this amazing venue, and they do these floral walls that are just breathtaking." She didn't ask if I could afford it. She assumed I'd figure it out. And I did. $47,000 later, I watched her walk down an aisle covered in imported petals, wearing a dress I'd taken a personal loan to buy. The photographer cost more than my monthly pension, and still she found something to complain about. The roses were too pink, she whispered to Grayson before the reception. They were supposed to be more cream-colored. They honeymooned in Santorini. I stayed home and worked a few shifts to catch up on the payments. After the wedding, they asked for help with a down payment. It's not just a house, Grayson told me, it's a foundation for the future. I gave them $45,000. Then came furniture, $8,000 more, new appliances, a home office set up so Grayson could work from home. At first he was polite and thankful. He would text a quick "thanks again, Carolyn" every time a check cleared. But that faded fast. He started calling me by my first name in a clipped tone, correcting me when I offered suggestions. "We've got this," he'd say, waving me off. Or, "Don't worry about things you don't understand." I tried not to take it personally. I told myself maybe he was stressed. Maybe he felt pressure to prove himself. But over time his tone hardened. He no longer hid his annoyance when I asked questions. He once told me after I gently suggested they avoid buying another new car on credit, "You don't know how the world works anymore, Carolyn." Lillian didn't defend me. She laughed, sometimes nervously, sometimes in agreement. I'd become the background noise in their life, the aging mother who funded their dreams, but had no real place in them. Still, I kept giving, because that's what mothers do, right? One evening, I sat alone in my small kitchen surrounded by opened envelopes and pending bills. The dishwasher hummed faintly behind me. An old model David had fixed himself years ago. The light above the sink flickered gently as the wind rattled the windows. I looked at my account balance, then at the list of expenses they'd sent over just that week. Grayson needed help with a consulting license. Lillian was struggling with grocery inflation. Hazel's ballet lessons, Wyatt's speech therapist, and a weekend getaway they said would help them reset emotionally. I set my glasses on the table and stared at the numbers. Negative signs, red totals, balances near empty. But I still told myself, this is love. This is what it looks like. Isn't it? I didn't have the strength yet to admit I'd been mistaken. Not entirely, not yet. But that night, as I watched the snow begin to fall outside, I did begin to wonder, for the first time in years, what loving someone truly meant. And if maybe I had confused love with sacrifice for far too long. It started with the transmission. Grayson had taken the car on a road trip with his buddies, something about a last-minute networking opportunity. A few days later, Lillian called me. Her voice strained and slightly panicked. "Mom, the car broke down on the highway. The mechanic says it's going to be $4,000 to replace the transmission. We just don't have it right now. So," I was slicing an apple when the call came in. I paused, holding the paring knife mid-air. $4,000, I asked softly. I know she said quickly, like she was trying to outrun my hesitation. But it's our only vehicle, and Hazel's got school, and Grayson needs it to find work. He's still interviewing, but this just hit us hard. Of course it did. I wired the money that afternoon. Then it was Emma's teeth. Or rather, Hazel's. I lose track sometimes. One of the kids had a dental emergency. Something about infection, swelling, a risk of long-term damage. That one cost $3,000. A week later, it was the roof. It's sagging in the middle, Lillian explained, and the contractor says it could collapse. We have kids sleeping under that roof, Mom. It was always urgent, always emotional, always timed perfectly so there wasn't space to breathe before the next thing. My savings dwindled like sand in an open palm, and still I kept giving. I had retired 2 years prior after decades of clocking in at 6 a.m., 5 or 6 days a week. I thought retirement would feel like a reward, but instead it became a series of financial calculations and quiet dread. I clipped coupons, I canceled cable, I sold David's old tools online, I started buying generic instead of brand names at the grocery store. Meanwhile, every time I visited Lillian's home, it looked newer, brighter. There were fresh paint colors in the living room, modern lighting fixtures, brand new stainless steel appliances in the kitchen. There was a hot tub on the back deck I didn't remember from before. One time I asked about it. "Oh, Grayson got it off Facebook Marketplace." "It was a great deal," she said quickly, eyes avoiding mine. Hazel had an iPad. Wyatt wore name-brand shoes. And there I was cutting dryer sheets in half to make them last longer. The shift in tone didn't happen all at once, but it was steady, like the tide rising. Lillian used to say thank you. A quick, love you, Mom, after each wire transfer. Over time, it turned into simple updates. Got it. Or nothing at all. Just a new request a few weeks later. I remember one moment so clearly it still burns. I was sitting at the kitchen table paying a utility bill with a check because I no longer trusted autopay after a bounced payment when Lillian called. Hey, we need help again. The furnace is acting up. We're freezing over here. I asked gently if she'd gotten a second opinion from another technician. There was silence. Then, Mom, this isn't the time for lectures. I'm telling you we need help. I just want to make sure it's not something that can wait. It can't, she snapped. Honestly, sometimes it feels like you care more about your checkbook than your grandkids. That one landed hard. I didn't even know what to say. I hung up shortly after transferred the money, then stared out the window for a long time. Snow had started to fall again. Cold and quiet. Everything always felt so quiet after I gave in. Like they took a breath, reset, and waited for the next crisis. Grayson, for his part, had stopped pretending. He no longer called me ma'am or acted appreciative. During one visit, he left a stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter like a silent message, then walked past me in his slippers, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. When I asked if he had followed up on any job leads, he smirked. I've been networking, he said, like that explained everything. Later, I overheard him in the backyard telling a neighbor, her name's on the checks, but it's our money. I mean, what else is she gonna do with it? That night, I barely slept. In conversations, Grayson started correcting me often. If I asked about their spending, he'd say things like, it's a generational thing. You wouldn't understand. Or worse, you raised a strong woman, Carolyn. Let her handle things. They began using the phrase family support more often, as if my retirement savings were a community fund. Once, when I mentioned I was thinking of getting a part-time job just to feel productive again, Grayson laughed. Well, good, he said. Maybe you can help us catch up on that hospital bill. I looked at Lillian. She said nothing, just kept scrolling through her phone. I began to see things more clearly piece by piece. Their problems were never really mine to solve. But I had made them mine. I had trained them to believe I would always say yes. That money would appear whenever needed. That their comfort was more important than my security. And they never had to ask kindly anymore, because I had taught them they didn't have to. What I once thought was love had morphed into obligation, and that obligation had rotted into something heavier. I was no longer mother or grandmother in their eyes. I was an account balance, a fallback plan. But still, I kept saying yes, because guilt is a quiet tyrant. It doesn't shout. It whispers softly that to stop would make you cruel. That love once promised can't be withheld without breaking something sacred. I told myself it was temporary. That when Grayson found stable work, when Lillian finished her certification, when Wyatt started kindergarten, when Hazel no longer needed tutoring, then things would ease up. But deep down, I was beginning to understand that there would always be another need, another moment of desperation, another crisis tailor-made to keep me tethered. And yet each time they called, I answered. Even as the numbers in my bank account dropped and my sense of worth slowly unraveled, I answered. Because I didn't know who I was if I wasn't helping them. Because I still believed somehow that one day they'd look at me not as a resource, but as a mother again. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone rang. I had just come in from grocery shopping, the cold still clinging to my coat. I set the bags on the counter and saw Lillian's name flashing on the screen. I didn't hesitate. I never did. I answered with a cheerful, "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice was tight, almost panicked. "Mom, the roof, it's bad. It's starting to dip in the middle. The contractor said it could collapse any day now." I stopped unpacking. Collapse. That sounds serious. Did you get an estimate? There was a pause. I could hear shuffling in the background and the clinking of dishes. Then Lillian sighed. "We don't have time for all that. We just need to fix it before someone gets hurt." "How much are we talking about?" 15,000, she said fast, like pulling off a bandage. "But we need it now. Today, if possible." 15,000. I leaned against the kitchen counter and took a breath. "Lillian, that's a lot of money. I need to see a detailed estimate before I can—" Before I could finish, another voice cut in. "Grayson." "We don't need another lecture, Carolyn." My spine stiffened at the way he said my name. Cold. Dismissive. Grayson wasn't yelling, but his tone sliced through the air. "It's always the same with you. You act like every request is some kind of scam. Like we haven't already told you we're desperate." "I just need to understand what the money's going toward," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What part of the roof is caving in, don't you get?" Lillian snapped. "Do you want Wyatt to wake up with a ceiling on his bed?" That hit me in the gut. They always knew how to twist the worry, how to dangle the kids like justification. Still, I swallowed hard and replied, "I understand, but I think it's reasonable to ask for documentation." Silence. Then I heard Grayson mutter something. Couldn't make it out entirely, but I caught the words, "control freak" and "holding out." When Lillian spoke again, her voice was sharper. "You know what, Mom? Maybe you should just keep your money. You clearly don't trust us." I didn't say that I began. "No," she cut in, voice rising. "You didn't have to. You're always judging, always needing proof, always acting like we're doing something wrong just by asking for help. Lillian, you're not part of this family anymore." The words dropped like bricks. My breath caught in my throat. I felt my heart stumble in my chest. For a moment, everything went still. The air, the room, my thoughts. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I whispered, not knowing what else to say. There was no response, just the sound of the call ending. I stood in my kitchen surrounded by bags of groceries that suddenly felt too heavy to unpack. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just stood there holding the phone like it might turn back into the lifeline it used to be. Later that evening, I decided to take a drive. I needed to get out of the house to breathe somewhere that didn't remind me of all the years I had said yes. I ended up near their neighborhood without even realizing I'd turned in that direction. I parked across the street from their house. Their windows were glowing warm with light. Through the curtains, I could see them in the kitchen. Lillian pouring something into a mug, Grayson leaning against the counter, talking with his hands. They looked relaxed, comfortable, laughing. I sat there for a long time, watching them live a life I had subsidized, a life they now lived without hesitation, without gratitude, a life that had no room for me anymore. That sentence echoed in my mind. "You're not part of this family anymore." I had paid for that roof. I had bought the dishes on their table, the couch they sat on, the refrigerator humming behind them. And now I was... what? A threat, a burden, an outsider. The betrayal wasn't just about the money, it was about the casual cruelty, the ease with which my daughter could cast me aside, like I was some obsolete appliance that no longer served its purpose. Driving home, I didn't turn the radio on. I needed the silence. I needed to sit with the weight of what had just happened. I replayed the conversation in my head over and over, dissecting every word, every tone, wondering how we had gotten here, wondering if I had allowed this to happen by being too generous for too long. When I got home, I walked straight to the small study where I kept my files. I turned on the lamp, the same one David used to read under, and pulled out the folders with all the old bank statements, copies of wire transfers, handwritten notes about every expense I'd covered over the years. I wasn't looking for revenge. Not yet. But I was starting to understand something important. That the version of love I had been living, unquestioning, bottomless, one-directional, wasn't love at all. It was fear. Fear of losing my only child. Fear of being alone. Fear of being irrelevant. And now that fear had come true anyway. I closed the folder and sat back in David's old leather chair. It still creaked the same way it had for years, as if whispering memory into my ears. I looked around the room. Quiet, warm, mine. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel guilty for being here alone. I felt something else. Resolve. I had spent decades trying to protect Lillian from hardship. But maybe I had only protected her from growing up. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop. The next morning I sat at my dining table, a cup of lukewarm tea beside me, and opened the oak filing cabinet tucked beneath the window. It had been years since I looked through it in full. Most people have junk drawers. Mine was a meticulously labeled archive of every financial choice I had ever made for my daughter. I had always kept records. David used to tease me for it. "You'd make a great accountant," he'd say, raising his eyebrows at the neat rows of folders color-coded by year. But I couldn't help it. It was just who I was. Methodical, cautious, thorough. At the time, I thought I was preparing for taxes or emergencies. I didn't know I was building a paper trail of my own heartbreak. The first folder was labeled Lillian, College. Inside every tuition bill from Northwestern, room and board, textbook receipts, dormitory fees, even the $200 deposit for her freshman orientation. 4 years' worth totaling more than $270,000. I traced my finger along the last check stub. It had taken everything: overtime, a second mortgage, small loans from old friends I never paid back in full. There was also the spring break trip to Cancun. I had tried to say no to that one. She'd cried, said all her friends were going, that she'd feel like an outcast if she stayed behind. I remember wiring the $100 to $300 while heating up soup for dinner. I pulled the next folder, Wedding. That one was thick too. Venue deposit, photographer, florals, her dress. A page torn from a bridal magazine with a pink sticky note. Love this bouquet style. My handwriting was on the bottom corner. $37,440 total. Next was house. The $45,000 down payment. The furniture that couldn't be secondhand. The custom nursery. A $6,000 patio set they insisted would help them entertain clients. I had paid for all of it. Then came the folder labeled Emergencies. That one made me pause. Inside were clippings of Panic, a copy of the $4,000 invoice for the car transmission, dental records and insurance rejection letters, a letter from the HVAC company about the broken furnace, an itemized list of roof repairs. Never completed. Most of these had come with midnight calls, frantic texts, voices shaking through the line. Each emergency had been a small explosion that demanded immediate resolution. And I had always been the firefighter. I added up the totals roughly in my head. Over $300,000. None of it had been loans. I had never asked for it back, never made them sign anything, never even suggested it might someday be repaid. They had stopped saying thank you long ago. Somewhere in the blur of crisis after crisis, the gratitude had vanished. In its place was expectation, and behind that expectation, resentment, as if my hesitations were cruel inconveniences in their perfect life narrative. I reached for David's old mug on the windowsill, now holding spare pens instead of coffee, and turned it in my hands. I could almost hear his voice, that quiet steadiness that had always grounded me. Love doesn't mean emptying yourself, he had told me once during a difficult year when I had worked 6 days a week and barely slept. I think I'm just doing what a good mom does, I'd said to him back then. No, he had replied gently. You're doing what you think love demands. But love isn't supposed to hollow you out. At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. Now, flipping through receipts and check stubs, I finally did. I had poured from a cup I never refilled. I had given until I stopped being seen as a person and started being seen as a solution. And somehow, in the process, I had erased myself. When did Lillian stop hugging me just because? When did she stop asking how I was? When did I become nothing more than the bank that bore her name? I picked up the invoice from the car repair dated nearly 2 years ago. I remembered that day. I'd skipped my prescription refill to send them that money. It's fine, I'd told myself. I'll catch up next week. But next week brought another crisis. My gaze drifted to the envelope that held Wyatt's birthday card. I'd sent $50 and a little puzzle I'd found on sale. Lillian hadn't acknowledged it. No text. No photo of him opening it. When I finally asked, she'd said, "Oh, I think it got lost in the shuffle. He gets so many gifts now. I had thought I was building family, holding it all together. But I wasn't holding anything. I was being held hostage by guilt and fear and obligation. I used to believe that love meant never letting them fall. But maybe, just maybe, falling is how people learn." I placed the last folder back in the cabinet slowly, carefully, as if closing a casket. It held the story of my silent undoing, the price of never saying no. I sat still for a long while after that, listening to the tick of the wall clock. The house was so quiet, peaceful, but there was an ache in that peace. Not loneliness exactly, something more honest, recognition. I had been giving out of fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of not being needed, fear of losing the only person who connected me to the life I once built with David. But what I had now wasn't connection, it was a transaction. And I was the only one still honoring the original agreement. Love isn't meant to be a sacrifice with no end. It isn't meant to be traded for scraps of acknowledgement or doled out like monthly rent. I ran my fingers across the spine of the medical folder and whispered the question that had been growing louder in my heart. Am I helping her? Or am I enabling her? The answer wasn't clear. Not yet. But I knew I couldn't keep pretending that what we had was love. Because love, real love, doesn't leave you empty and erased. It fills you. It sees you. And for the first time in a very long time, I wanted to be seen. The Monday after I closed that cabinet, I called Anthony. He had been our family's lawyer for years, mostly handling routine matters. David's will, my retirement planning, basic real estate paperwork. A quiet man with a steady voice and eyes that didn't blink when difficult truths were spoken. When I told his secretary that I needed to revise my estate plan due to recent family complications, she gave me a same-week appointment without asking questions. His office still smelled like old leather and lemon polish. He offered me tea, which I politely declined, then sat down across from me, hands folded. "I'm ready to take some steps," I said. Not out of anger, out of necessity. I laid out the history as methodically as I had once balanced David's books: dates, amounts, context. Anthony took notes, silently nodding now and then. I showed him my spreadsheet of undocumented gifts categorized by year and nature. College, housing, medical, emergency after emergency. Over $300,000 in total. When I finished, he leaned back and took a deep breath. "You understand that without written loan agreements, recovering these funds as debt would be legally shaky," he said. "I'm not trying to recover it," I replied. "I'm trying to change the story." He blinked. "Go on." "I want leverage, not revenge, not repayment. I want them to feel the weight of their decisions for once. I want consequences, not in anger, but in clarity." Anthony nodded slowly, then said something that would change everything. "You could buy their debts." I blinked. "What if Grayson or Lillian are in significant debt? Especially unsecured debt. Those creditors often sell it at a discount to collection agencies. You could form a legal entity, a collections agency, and buy up the liabilities. You'd then own the rights to collect. Completely legal. Completely enforceable." I stared at him, stunned by the elegance of it. Not cruelty, not drama, just quiet justice. "I'll need a name," I murmured. "Something neutral, professional, Midwest Recovery Services." I smiled faintly. Perfect. By the end of the week, the paperwork was in motion. Anthony drew up incorporation documents. I opened a new bank account under the agency's name. Everything was clean above board, separate from my personal assets. If this ever went to court, it would hold. But before I could act, I needed information. That's when Savannah entered the picture. She came recommended by Anthony, a private investigator who worked out of a small office above a hardware store on 3rd Street. She wore sensible shoes, spoke in short sentences, and carried an air of quiet competence that immediately put me at ease. I handed her a folder with all the information. I had Grayson's full name, date of birth, known aliases, last 4 of his social security number, and everything I could remember about their finances. I need to know how deep it goes, I told her. I'm not looking to shame them. I just need to understand what I'm up against. She nodded once. Give me 4 days. 3 days later, I received an encrypted email with her report. I printed it out and spread the pages across my dining table just like I used to with Lillian's college applications. Grayson was drowning. He owed $47,000 in gambling debt, mostly to online betting platforms, but some to smaller, less savory outfits that didn't appear on standard credit reports. He had maxed out 4 credit cards totaling $28,000. He also had a payday loan from a high-interest company, 36% APR, due in full within 90 days. Their mortgage was 3 months past due. The bank had issued a preliminary foreclosure notice 2 weeks prior. I stared at the figures in disbelief. Every dollar I had sent had gone straight through their hands, funneled to creditors used to buy time. They weren't struggling. They were imploding. And they'd told no one. I folded the pages carefully and placed them in a folder labeled Leverage. The irony wasn't lost on me. That night I sat at my desk and stared out the window. The holiday lights had started to appear around the neighborhood, gentle glows of red and gold and green flickering in the quiet dark. My house was undecorated. I hadn't celebrated properly in years. I'd always spent the season traveling to Lillian's, helping her shop for the kids' wiring money for last-minute gifts, trying to feel included. This year I decided would be different. So I picked up the phone and called her. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, soft and warm. She sounded surprised. "Oh, hi, Mom. I've been thinking about what you said last time, about the roof, and I may have been a bit too harsh. I didn't realize things were so bad." Relief bloomed instantly in her voice. "Thank you. I didn't want to push, it's just... things are tight. Grayson's been so stressed. I understand I said... That's why I've been talking to my financial advisor. I think I can help. Maybe 50,000, possibly more." Dead silence. I could almost hear her heartbeat pick up. Really, she breathed. "Mom, we don't deserve that. I mean, if you could, it would save us." "Well, I want to do it right. No rush, just some paperwork to make it clean for taxes. I'll keep you posted." After we hung up, I sat back and listened to the quiet ring in the room. I imagined her telling Grayson, their excitement swelling visions of clean slates and shopping sprees dancing behind their eyes. They were preparing for a gift. They had no idea a reckoning was coming instead. That week, I began to see the shift. Lillian called more often, once to tell me how Hazel had gotten an A in math, another time to ask what my favorite holiday dish was. Grayson even left a voicemail. Carolyn just wanted to say thanks for thinking of us. Means a lot. They were grooming me again, shaping the narrative, building toward the moment they would unveil their best selves for the holidays. I could almost picture the scene, a beautifully set Christmas table. Soft lights, a room full of family and me, the benefactor softened by sentiment and holiday cheer. But they weren't the only ones planning. I had documents to prepare, ownership to transfer, a structure to finalize. They were expecting forgiveness wrapped in a check. I was preparing consequences, sealed in legal envelopes. Christmas was coming. And this time it would bring clarity, not comfort. Christmas Day arrived with a sky so clear it looked painted. The streets were still lined with cars wrapped in frost. I had never been much for the holiday season after David passed, but this year felt especially strange. I moved slowly that morning, sipping my coffee from his old mug, letting the warmth settle into my hands, while I went over the final checklist one last time. The documents were pressed flat in a manila envelope, tucked into the inner pocket of my coat. Property transfer, debt consolidation statements, formal notice of eviction effective, December 27th, Anthony had reviewed every word, every line. Everything was correct, airtight, legal. I folded my coat carefully over the chair and stood for a moment staring out the window as sunlight caught on the frost outside. They thought today was going to be a performance, a show of unity, an emotional stage set for my forgiveness. But I wasn't playing that role anymore. I arrived at 2 o'clock sharp. The driveway was already full. Margaret's rental car. Uncle Rob's pickup, a few cars I didn't recognize. The house looked like a holiday magazine cover. Garlands wrapped perfectly around the columns, wreaths on every window, inflatable reindeer bouncing slightly in the wind, lights blinking in coordinated rhythm across the porch railings. It was all so curated, so deliberate, like they'd poured every borrowed dollar into creating a fantasy. Lillian opened the door before I could knock. She was wearing a deep red velvet dress, the kind that photographs well. Her hair was curled, makeup, flawless smile bright enough to blind. "Mom, you're here," she said, embracing me like we hadn't gone months without speaking. "Everyone's been asking about you." I stepped inside. The warmth hit me immediately. The smell of pine cinnamon and something roasting in the oven. The living room sparkled with carefully placed decorations. A massive tree stood in the corner, wrapped in white and gold ribbon gifts, piled beneath it like a department store display. Margaret came to greet me, her hug sincere if slightly awkward. "You look wonderful, Carolyn. We're so glad you could make it. We've missed you." Someone else chimed in. Grayson appeared at my elbow. "Carolyn! Merry Christmas," he said, extending a hand that gripped mine just a second too long. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I smiled politely and took in the room. So many faces, all expecting a warm holiday memory. All unaware of what was sitting quietly in the pocket of my coat. Dinner was extravagant. Prime rib glazed carrots, truffle, mashed potatoes, cranberry compote served in glass dishes I recognized from my own china cabinet, gifted to them years ago. Conversation flowed with surface-level ease. Updates on jobs, kids, weather, anything but what hung silently in the air between Lillian and me. She kept glancing at Grayson, who gave subtle nods like a director cueing his star actress. When dessert was cleared, Lillian stood up, her voice sweet and theatrical. "Shall we open gifts?" she asked brightly. Everyone shuffled into the living room, gathering near the tree. The kids squealed with excitement. Lillian took her place near the pile, reaching for each gift with a flourish. She handed out box after box. Leather gloves for Uncle Rob, a silk scarf for Margaret, tech gadgets for the cousins, high-end lotions for the aunts. Each item was wrapped with care, ribboned and tagged with love. Lillian narrated every choice, explaining how she'd searched for hours to find the perfect thing. Grayson stood beside her, smiling at the applause, nodding along as if this display proved their stability, their generosity, their worth. The stack of presents dwindled. People were admiring their gifts, murmuring thank yous and hugging each other. Lillian reached for one final box, checked the label, then looked up with a carefully constructed look of confusion. "Oh," she said, placing a hand to her chest. "Mom, I think we forgot yours." The room went still. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. You could have heard a fork drop onto the rug. Lillian's voice took on that mock-sincere tone she used when she wanted to appear innocent. "Things have been really tight this year. I hope you understand." All eyes turned to me, some with pity, some with curiosity, a few waiting for a scene, a dramatic moment of heartbreak or forgiveness. Lillian stood there, eyes wide, smile frozen, expecting me to wilt. Instead, I stood up, slowly, brushed invisible lint from my coat and said softly, "That's perfectly fine." Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope. Actually, I continued holding it with both hands. "I have something for all of you." Every head turned. 20 pairs of eyes followed the motion as I opened the envelope and withdrew the documents, fanning them gently on the coffee table, like a magician laying down her final card. "This house," I said clearly, "now belongs to me." Lillian blinked rapidly, her mouth half open. Grayson stepped forward. Confusion melting into alarm. What? What are you talking about? He asked. I tapped the top document. As of December 26th, ownership has been legally transferred. Due to unpaid debts totaling over $75,000 and a mortgage that hasn't been serviced in 3 months, this property now falls under my legal claim. You have 48 hours to vacate. Gasps. A muffled cry. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Lillian's face drained of color. Grayson's fists clenched at his sides. "This is insane," he hissed. "You can't just—" "Everything I've done," I said calmly, "is entirely legal. These documents reflect 15 years of financial support that was never acknowledged, never repaid, and ultimately never respected. You're destroying us," Lillian whispered, her voice cracking. I looked at her, really looked, and said, "You told me I wasn't part of this family anymore. I'm simply honoring that request." Margaret tried to interject. "Carolyn, please, it's Christmas." "And that's exactly why I came today," I replied, "because I wanted to deliver this in person. Not out of anger, out of honesty." The room erupted. Cousins talking over each other, aunts trying to calm the chaos, children crying. But through it all I felt strangely serene, as if the storm around me was just wind in a windowless room. Grayson stepped toward me, his voice rising. "You're vindictive. This is about control, not justice." "No," I said, picking up my coat. "This is about consequences, something you've never truly experienced." Lillian reached for my arm. "What about Hazel? What about Wyatt?" I paused, looked down at her trembling hand on my sleeve. "I hope one day they'll understand that enabling isn't love, and letting someone face reality isn't cruelty." As I stepped toward the door, the shouting faded behind me. Just muffled noise and the rustle of wrapping paper being pushed aside. I opened the front door to the crisp December air, and for the first time in years, I walked away without looking back. No rage, no regrets. Only the quiet satisfaction of finally being heard. The fallout began the very next morning. At 7:42 a.m., my phone buzzed. Then again, and again. I didn't have to check to know who it was. Lillian's number lit up the screen, followed by Grayson's. Then a string of text messages, most of them starting with "Mom" or "Please" or "You can't mean this." I didn't answer. I had said everything I needed to say, and I had said it in the most truthful language they understood. Consequence. By noon, the official letters from Midwest Recovery Services had been delivered by certified mail to their doorstep. The company name may have been unfamiliar, but the debts it referenced were not. Grayson now saw in black and white what I had quietly acquired behind the scenes. His gambling debts, his credit card obligations, even the overdue mortgage balance now linked to me. I owned them all. From my car parked 2 blocks away, I watched through binoculars as Lillian stood at the window, clutching the envelopes, pale and motionless. Grayson paced behind her like a cornered animal. Even from a distance, I could feel the panic rolling off them in waves. They had no idea how fast the cracks would spread. 2 days later, their credit cards were frozen. The emergency line of credit I had once co-signed was called in. The family SUV disappeared from the driveway, repossessed before dawn. Lawn care stopped. The festive lights around their front porch darkened one by one. They canceled their internet, then their streaming services. It was a house unraveling from the inside out. The calls turned desperate, then accusatory. I stopped reading the messages after the 5th one that included the words heartless and unfit. I started saving everything. Screenshots, voicemails. I created a digital folder labeled Meeks because I knew what was coming next. Sure enough, within a week I received a call from Harold, my attorney. His voice was calm, but his words were clipped. "They've hired Jonathan Meeks." I exhaled slowly. Of course they have. Meeks was known locally as an aggressive family lawyer who made a name for himself taking on elder care disputes. His tactics weren't elegant, but they were loud. He didn't need truth to work in his favor. Just confusion. "Claims have been filed with your bank." Harold continued, alleging financial manipulation. There was also a call placed to the local police department suggesting diminished capacity, and someone, most likely Grayson, called the senior center implying you might be experiencing cognitive decline. I closed my eyes. He's trying to paint me as senile. He's trying to regain control, Harold said. But don't worry, we've prepared for this. And we had. 3 weeks prior, I had undergone a full medical and mental health evaluation with Dr. Harrison, a geriatric specialist known for his thorough assessments. I'd sat through hours of cognitive testing, memory recall, attention exercises, even social scenario analysis. At the time, I'd felt a little silly. Now, I was grateful for every minute of it. The report was airtight cognitive function normal for age decision-making. Intact, no signs of impairment. Harold had it filed and time-stamped before Meeks ever picked up the phone. He also had years' worth of bank statements, notarized receipts, and canceled checks showing my financial support for Lillian and Grayson. Every dollar carefully documented. My financial advisor provided a signed summary of my consistent patterns, predictable withdrawals, traceable transfers, no evidence of coercion. But still the noise grew. I started getting strange calls from relatives. My sister Eleanor rang twice in one evening, her voice caught between concern and suspicion. Carolyn Lillian said you've been acting strange, that you gave away the house on a whim and now you're trying to evict her over a misunderstanding. Is everything okay? I paused, then asked Eleanor. When was the last time you talked to Lillian when she wasn't asking for something? There was silence on the other end. That's what I thought, I said gently. Neighbors approached me at the mailbox. One mentioned Grayson had come by asking for character references. Another said Lillian claimed I had been conned by some legal scam that I was in over my head. But their stories didn't hold. Because people remembered. They remembered the birthdays I paid for, the soccer uniforms I bought, the groceries I dropped off, the years of check-writing, gas money, babysitting. They remembered how often I had been called in the middle of the night, how many times I'd picked up Hazel or Wyatt when someone couldn't make it. They remembered my consistency, my quiet presence, my giving heart. I didn't have to defend myself loudly. The facts did that for me. Then something unexpected happened. Pastor Williams called. I got a message from Lillian, he said. She asked me to check on you. Said she's worried about your decision-making and emotional health. I'm fine, I replied with a calm I didn't even have to fake. I'm simply holding someone accountable for the first time in 15 years. There was a long pause. I've counseled many families, he said, and I've seen this before, where guilt is weaponized until it feels like love. You're not alone, Carolyn. That night I wrote a summary for Harold. Every lie, every accusation, every attempt to frame me as incompetent. I backed it all up with voicemail timestamps, email threads, and screenshots. I wasn't just defending myself. I was building a wall they couldn't climb over again. The final straw came when Lillian left a voicemail, sobbing. You're ruining everything, Mom. You're turning people against us. We just want our life back. But it had never been their life. It had been borrowed, bought with guilt, paid for with my silence. And now that silence was over. 2 days later, the sheriff's notice was taped to their front door. Formal notice of eviction effective in 30 days. Neighbors saw it. Friends whispered. The perfect couple with the perfect home suddenly didn't look so perfect anymore. I watched from a distance as Lillian stood on the porch, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Grayson kicked the mailbox, then stormed inside. I knew what was happening behind those walls. The blame, the shouting, the unraveling. They had finally run out of people to point fingers at. And in that wreckage, I felt no joy. Only clarity and peace. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just holds the line and refuses to bend anymore. It took me less than a week to dismantle what had taken 15 years to build. On Monday morning, I sat at my kitchen table, phone in hand, and began the calls. First, to the credit card company. One I had opened years ago, just in case for Lillian with my name as the primary account holder, and hers as the authorized user. I had kept it active silently, covering occasional charges that seemed to magically appear: birthday decorations, groceries, flight tickets. She insisted were emergencies. I'd like to close the account, I told the representative. Effective immediately. Are you sure, Ms. Stewart? She asked, reading from her screen. It appears there are pending charges. I'm completely sure, I said, and please cancel all authorized users as well. Then I called the insurance provider. Lillian Grayson and the children had been on my health policy for 8 years. They had stopped contributing to premiums 2 years ago. I'd like to remove dependents from my family plan, I told the woman on the line. Her tone shifted. All dependents. Yes, I replied. Every one of them. I closed the joint savings account next. That one had been opened back when Grayson was between jobs, for the 3rd time in 1 year. I'd thought giving them access to emergency funds would help them plan better, show them responsibility. But instead it had become a bottomless pit of withdrawals with no explanation. I walked into the bank and signed the transfer forms in person. The teller looked surprised. It's been a shared account for a long time, she commented politely. I've learned, I said, smiling that long doesn't always mean healthy. Then came the trust documents. Anthony helped me rework everything. Lillian was removed as my beneficiary. I revoked her access to my estate, my pension, my remaining savings. My life insurance was updated, no longer going to her or her children. In her place, I created something new. The Carolyn Stewart Opportunity Fund, a small scholarship program initially modest built to provide tuition assistance to young women aging out of the foster care system. Girls who had no one to pay for their textbooks, no one to help them afford housing during college breaks, no one to wire them money when car repairs wiped out their savings. It wasn't just about cutting off Lillian. It was about giving where giving could still do good. The woman at the charitable foundation office blinked when I explained what I wanted to set up. You don't want to include your grandchildren? I paused, then said gently, No. This is about ending a pattern and starting a new one. That same week, I started hearing stories through the grapevine. Lillian had sold her wedding ring, the one Grayson had insisted on upgrading after their 5th anniversary. She got less than half its value. Grayson had picked up shifts at a shipping warehouse, a far cry from the consulting work he always boasted about at family dinners. People said he looked thinner, pale, not angry, just exhausted. The house was on notice. The sheriff's posting was no longer a rumor. It had been photographed and shared around the neighborhood group chat. Their lights were off most nights now, the luxury sedan gone. The Christmas decorations packed away mid-January and never replaced with anything. No one said anything to me directly, but I noticed who stopped calling them, who stopped visiting, who turned away when they saw Lillian at the grocery store. One neighbor told me quietly over coffee, I used to think they had it all together. But now, I don't know, it's like we all woke up. And I did too. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to fix it. I wasn't trying to protect them from the consequences they'd spent years earning. I simply let the truth reveal itself. Margaret called again after hearing from a family friend. Did you really cut her out of everything? She asked, her voice edged with disbelief. I did, I replied. And I wish I had done it sooner. She says you're trying to ruin her life. No, I said gently. I just stopped sacrificing mine. The silence hung heavy for a few moments. She says the kids are confused. I imagine they are, I said. But hopefully not for long. Hopefully they'll understand one day that real love has boundaries. At night I no longer flinched at the sound of my phone. The silence that once haunted me now felt like peace. I played soft jazz while I cooked. I read in bed without checking my balance. I looked in the mirror and saw someone coming back into focus. A woman not drained, not dismissed, but whole again. What hurt most was not that I had to sever ties. It was the realization that I'd never truly been seen by them. I had been their fallback, their silent partner, their never-say-no safety net. And when I stopped, their affection disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. But now something else had begun. Letters arrived from scholarship applicants. girls with trembling handwriting thanking Ms. Stewart for believing in their potential. One of them wrote, "I've never had a mom, but your kindness makes me think I can become someone anyway." I cried when I read that one, because she saw me, and she didn't want anything but the chance to grow. That I realized was what giving was supposed to feel like, not depletion, but renewal. The calls didn't stop. They simply changed in tone. The first few were frantic. Lillian sobbing so hard her words broke apart mid-sentence. "Mom, please, please don't do this. For the kids." Hazel asked why her friends won't come over anymore. Wyatt doesn't understand why we can't go to Target. She leaned hard on the word family as if it were a magic spell that could reverse everything with a single breath. I didn't answer. The voicemails grew longer, more desperate. She spoke of sleepless nights of Grayson working double shifts of the house getting colder by the day. "We know we messed up," she whispered in one. "But we're still your family. Doesn't that mean something?" Then came the turn. The grief sharpened into anger. Grayson's voice appeared in the background, rising like thunder behind her pleads. One message left at 1:37 a.m. came from him directly. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You think you can humiliate us and just walk away? We'll see what the courts think about elder abuse, about emotional manipulation, about you rewriting your will out of spite." There it was. The threat they always kept in their back pocket, now finally thrown onto the table. The next day, a letter arrived via courier. Thick white envelope, heavy paper. An official demand from Jonathan Meeks, their attorney, requesting the reinstatement of Lillian as beneficiary to my estate, citing undue emotional influence and potential cognitive decline. I read it once, then again. Then I scanned it, saved a PDF copy, and dropped it into a digital folder labeled Protection. Alongside it were every voicemail, every text, every email. Their voices, their tone, their timing, it all built a pattern. One I would not let them twist against me. I didn't respond. Not to the letter, not to the calls, not to the texts that now ranged from hostile to pitiful in the span of a single afternoon. Instead, I lived quietly. I woke up, made coffee, walked around the block. I sat in my small backyard and watched squirrels dart through bare trees. I organized my books, cooked dinner for myself without planning for leftovers to send to someone else. I listened to music I hadn't played in years. And I started clearing out the storage closet. It was time. David's things had lived there untouched since the year he passed. I'd always told myself I wasn't ready, that it would hurt too much. But the truth was I had been holding on to the past like a life raft even as it pulled me under. I opened the top shelf and found the box labeled Anniversary. Inside, the silver cufflinks he wore on our wedding day. A dried boutonniere fragile with time. And nestled in tissue paper, the pearl earrings he had given me on our 25th year together. Lillian had always loved them. She used to ask to borrow them for special occasions, and I'd let her watching her admire herself in the mirror. I knew she believed they'd be hers someday. Part of her inheritance, part of the legacy she assumed would flow to her without question. But I didn't feel right leaving them to someone who no longer saw me as a person. Just a path to more things. I held the earrings for a long time, the pearls soft against my palm. Then I stood, crossed the room, and placed them in a new velvet box. Not for Lillian. For the scholarship auction. A small gift toward a future she'd never understand. Later that week, Eleanor called. We hadn't spoken much since the confrontation at Christmas. I could tell from her tone that she'd finally heard the whole story. Or at least enough of it. Lillian called me. She began crying about how cold you've become. About how you turned on them. She made it sound like you were unraveling. "And what do you think?" I asked. There was a pause. Then she sighed. "I think I've been too quick to believe the version of events she handed me. And now I see it differently." I didn't say anything. I let her keep going. "You've always been the steady one, Carolyn. Always gave more than anyone saw. And I just wanted to say, "You've done the right thing. I know it couldn't have been easy. It still wasn't. But hearing her say that, hearing someone finally acknowledge the weight I had carried in silence, it meant more than I expected." "Thank you," I said quietly. We hung up a few minutes later, promising to meet for coffee soon. No pressure. Just two sisters reconnecting on new, gentler ground. That night, I returned to the jewelry box. I tucked the earrings inside, closed the lid, and placed it at the very back of the donation bin. Not out of bitterness. Not out of spite. Out of closure. I no longer owed the past any space in my present. The calls eventually slowed, then stopped. Not because they had accepted what had happened, but because they had run out of stories to tell, out of people to manipulate, out of ways to twist the truth. And I kept living. Not extravagantly, not loudly, but honestly. And for the first time in decades, that was enough. New Year's Eve arrived, wrapped in silence. The kind of silence that used to ache. The kind that once reminded me of everything I'd lost. But this year it was different. The quiet didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I lit a single candle on the table and opened the bottle of champagne David and I had been saving for some special occasion that never came. I had dusted it off that morning, fingers trembling slightly as I turned it in my hands. He'd bought it the year before he passed. A splurge, he called it. A promise for the future. Now, 2 decades later, I opened it alone. But not lonely. The bubbles rose in the glass as I walked slowly to the living room and sat down across from the fireplace. David's photo sat on the mantel. Simple, unframed, always slightly tilted to the right. I never bothered to straighten it. That small imperfection had become familiar, even comforting. The clock ticked toward midnight. The house was still. Outside, soft snow drifted down in quiet flakes, layering rooftops and tree branches, with a sense of calm the world rarely allowed. The only sound was the occasional crackle from the heater and the soft chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway. No phone calls, no demands, no carefully worded messages laced with manipulation, no threats, no guilt, just peace. 15 years I had spent waiting for the next crisis. The next midnight call, the next request disguised as an emergency. I had memorized the rhythm of their needs, trained myself to respond before they even finished asking. I had built my identity around being useful, being available, being what they needed whether they deserved it or not. But not anymore. This year had been brutal. There was no denying that. There were nights I questioned myself. Days I paced the floors of this quiet house wondering if I had gone too far. If maybe I really had turned cold. But slowly, steadily, the doubt gave way to something stronger. The truth. I hadn't turned cold. I had turned inward. I had turned toward myself. It was a kind of warmth I had forgotten existed. I took a sip of champagne, the bubbles sharp and smooth on my tongue, and looked around at the room I had once only passed through on my way to fix someone else's fire. Tonight it was lit only by the soft glow of the fireplace and the shimmer of lights on the mantel. I hadn't decorated for the holidays this year, not in the traditional sense, but I had added little touches. Things that were just for me. A garland of dried oranges I made by hand, a new blanket, soft and heavy, draped over the armchair, a set of tea candles lined along the windowsill, no flash, no spectacle, just comfort. The phone sat on the coffee table, face down, silent. There were no more messages, no more tricks disguised as affection, no more using the word mom like a password to guilt. They had stopped calling. I had stopped answering. Some people might call that sad, but for me it was a beginning. Earlier that day I had gone through the last of the old boxes in the attic. I donated what I didn't need, kept what made me smile, and shredded what no longer had a place in the future I was building. I even found David's old journal tucked between 2 shoeboxes. He wasn't a writer, not really, but sometimes he jotted things down. Ideas. Feelings. Notes to himself. On the inside cover in faded blue ink he had written, "Don't lose yourself trying to hold on to someone else. I read it 3 times before closing the book gently and placing it on my nightstand. The clock on the wall ticked over to midnight. Fireworks popped faintly in the distance. Not many. Just enough to mark the passing of time. I didn't stand. I didn't make a toast. I just sat there with my glass in one hand and the other resting gently on the arm of the chair, watching the snow fall. The woman I was last year wouldn't recognize the one sitting here now. She would have flinched at the silence, worried what she had done wrong. She would have rushed to fix to call to beg for a sliver of validation. She would have chased the illusion that love meant sacrificing yourself entirely. But not this woman. This woman had learned. She had faced disappointment, betrayal, isolation, and still found her way home. Not to a place, but to herself. I looked over at David's picture and raised my glass slightly. "You were right," I whispered. "Love doesn't mean disappearing." And finally I understood what real love looks like. It's not begging to be seen, it's seeing yourself. And not apologizing for it. I finished my champagne, slowly letting the last sip linger. The snow outside continued to fall in soft, steady waves. The street lamp across the road flickered gently, lighting the sidewalk in a glow that reminded me of childhood. I stood up, turned off the lamp, and made my way to bed. No thoughts of what tomorrow would bring. No anxiety about what I had to do for anyone else. No fear of the phone. Just the quiet hum of a house that finally belonged to me again. I lay down, pulled the blanket over my shoulders, and smiled in the dark. I hadn't reclaimed my money. I had reclaimed myself. If Carolyn's story touched something deep within you, maybe a memory, a wound, or even a quiet truth you've tried to ignore, know that you're not alone. Have you ever given so much of yourself to someone that you forgot where you ended and they began? Have you ever confused sacrifice with love? Until it nearly broke you. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments below, because your voice might be the one someone else needs to hear today. And if you found strength in Carolyn's quiet courage, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss more life stories like this. Stories of healing boundaries and rediscovering your worth. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.